Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nicholas Phillips, and I'll be serving as your host and moderator. Today, we're discussing how we can better understand vulnerabilities within our organization and how we can anticipate problems that could result in a crisis. Now, some of these crises are things like equipment failure, legal trouble, and loss of intellectual property. Yes, it's tough for some of us to think about the worst case scenarios. We don't want to imagine that things could go terribly wrong. But conducting a crisis audit can help us and our organization be better prepared. Some questions we'll help answer for you include, what are the characteristics of a crisis? And what are the benefits of having not just a crisis response team, but a diverse one? Before we get started, though, some housekeeping things. We want to learn a little bit about you, our audience. We'll be asking you a series of questions throughout to help us tailor our conversation. You can also submit questions either through the chat dialog box in the top right corner or through the QR code on your screen. We'll be also posting some helpful links in the chat as well. Now, one important link for you is the crisis management exercise. We'll be referencing this a few times throughout our conversation today. So our first question is part of the crisis management exercise that we'd like you to answer is, what are one or two potential crises you feel that your organization really isn't prepared for? So as we wait for your responses, for those who are watching the recorded version, the exercise sheet and some of these resources can be found right at the bottom of the registration page there. And as we wait for your responses, let me introduce you to the reason we're all here. Our returning champion, Nellie Brown, serves as the Director of Workplace Health and Safety Programs for the Worker Institute at Cornell University's ILR School. Nellie is a certified industrial hygienist. She's also authored numerous occupational health hazard manuals, and her publications have been downloaded over 250,000 times in over 180 countries. But today she'll be delving into the 11 families of crises and consider a variety of areas of potential risk. And we'll discuss where to focus your management and recovery plan efforts on. Nellie, thank you so much for joining us today. And I really want to kind of baseline our conversation for our audience today. So Nellie, I want to start off by asking you, how do you define a crisis when it comes to a work environment?
Well, if you want to take a look at one of my slides here, I can really give you the two-part definition that to me is it encapsulates the real core of the issue. You know, when you have a crisis, you really have two aspects to it. One is that your organization clearly does not have the resources to cope with it, and it's going to negatively impact you. So when you look at the seriousness of a crisis, the reason why it hits so badly is because people have not planned for it, the resources are not there, and so pretty soon the event is out of control.
Mm-hmm. And why is it so difficult for organizations to think about what potential crises could happen?
Well, I think it's a very human problem. We are not real good at taking the long view on things. We tend to be, looking at what happens in the short term, and it's very difficult for us to really think about envisioning nasty things, imagining the worst that can happen here. And it's the ability to do that which is really so very important. And it's not a pleasant thing to do. I always like to commend people like yourselves for attending today, because this is a very difficult type of exercise really to accomplish. And when you think about how crises can really unfold, people are forever giving me reasons why they don't want to do it. And the reasons don't necessarily sound very wonderful when you're responsible for an organization and its future. You know, the idea that, oh, when it happens, we'll deal with it, or we'll think on our feet, or whatever that is, it can never happen here. So people are just so reluctant to give any time and energy to this, even though the payback can be so remarkable. And in fact, if you look at studies of companies that have done a good job of planning for crisis, they see better profitability, better return on investment. They face fewer crises because whatever comes their way, they head off and it becomes a non-event. And so I think it's very, very justifiable to make a good business case for why you want to do this.
Mm-hmm. And what excuses maybe do you hear the most often from organizations about saying maybe let's not plan for a crisis? Is there one in particular that you hear often?
I would say most commonly the excuse is this will never happen here. Whatever it is that I suggest or ideas that come in, oh, this will never happen here. And in fact, I always think back, I won't name it, but an organization a few years ago that I was dealing with where they invited me back a year after the first time I'd done some work with them on crisis. And one of the categories for crisis, they had insisted will never happen here. And when they called me back a year later, that was one of the crises they most wanted to work on. Yes, it came back and had a very nasty bite to it. So what you think can never happen here, there's where your gaping vulnerability is probably going to be.
I can only imagine what that was kind of like for you to, have this organization that was like, oh, it'll never happen here, but then it happens, and then it's like, well, we could have planned for it.
Well, privately, I got a little bit of a laugh, but when, they spoke to me about what happened when that crisis actually unfolded, it was a pretty sad situation, but, it's just kind of one of those rueful laughs, and everything. She's, okay, well, you didn't want to do it before, and guess what, so.
Mm-hmm. And what are some well-documented examples of, organizations that have and maybe haven't planned for a potential crisis, and what were the results of some of these unplanned crises?
Well, I think when you look at ones that are that really hit people badly, I always think back to the influenza epidemic we had in 2009, and I was trying to get people after that to think very seriously about crisis planning for disease, to look at what that would mean if a whole bunch of your workforce is, can't show up, or they're home sick, or they're caregiving, or they're in the hospital, or whatever. And all the various arguments I got about that, because people said to me, no, we have a great medical system in the U.S., we have great, scientists and researchers. We'll produce vaccines and treatments and drugs, and we don't have to worry. Pandemics will never hit badly here. Well, the last couple of years have shown us what that assumption is made. But you think, organizations that, face problems that sometimes you wonder, is there any way we could help, fend this off perfectly? Someone tampers with your product when it hits the store shelf. How do we develop perfect anti-tamper? How do you do that? Or an organization faces nasty publicity, and they handled the situation very well. And when it came to the crisis itself, it's the communication they botched badly. So what was left in the public's perception was, this organization doesn't know what the heck they're doing. Why should I buy their stuff or do business with them? A lot of times, you think that the issue is going to be a very simple one, but loss of reputation, perception in the public's mind, these are very difficult areas of confidence to regain when you experience that, because things spread so widely, and not just in the regular news, but in the social media. So you can trash, an organization's reputation pretty thoroughly this way.
And, one thing you kind of touched on a little bit, and I know you'll kind of go a little bit deeper into, was I wanted to check and see, what did some of these organizations do well when it came to planning their process as far as, planning for a potential crisis?
Well, for a lot of organizations, particularly ones that I've interacted with, or I observed them, in the media and so forth. And I tend to think a lot of times people have done a pretty good job envisioning problems they've experienced in the past or that have happened to industries in the same category as themselves. But if it's outside that, then they don't seem to do as good a job. They don't think that can really happen, or it's less likely. They're not going to worry about it. And a lot of times organizations feel that if they've survived a particular crisis, then wonderful, let's celebrate and move on, where they don't take the time to reflect, learn from it, and see where they could improve. They just congratulate themselves they made it through, as though that were the end of the story, when in fact, you've just paid a big price for information. You're foolish to not learn from that. I always think the School of Hard Knocks is a very, very good educator. It's just the tuition is really high.
Actually, speaking of the School of Hard Knocks, I was actually just thinking, do you find kind of throughout, all the different programs that you've done, do you find that a lot of companies do tend to go back and kind of rework their plan, or do they, maybe get through a crisis and are like, all right, well, we planned well enough, we don't need to change? Do you find that's the case, or is it more on the other side where it's, okay, we made it through this crisis, what can we do better? Do you see one or the other?
I tend to find that when I've taken people through this kind of thoroughness of imagining what can go wrong, they're very good at going back and tweaking, or doing some major work. I just think of one organization where, as soon as the day was over of doing the full program, the participants went and got one of the VPs for that location, and brought him in to take a look at their work product and point out some areas they were going to focus on, and vulnerabilities they were going to fix. So yeah, I had one organization where the sample scenario I took them through was so realistic that they took notes off of all the flip charts and then went and shredded them, because they were so afraid that the scenario I'd created would get out into the media as something that had really happened, and they wanted to safeguard against that. So it varies, but I tend to think that people tend to run with the work product. They're really very good about that, and it sort of varies a bit, because if I'm doing this for a particular workplace, then they're open about what they're facing and so on, because it's just among themselves. When I do it for a public program where there's a group, people may have come with maybe one or two people from the organization, but they only talk among themselves because they don't want to reveal vulnerabilities. That's not what they're there to do, is to show where their weaknesses are. But certainly everyone listens to everybody else, and they really get a lot of useful information just by listening. But I think that's true for us as adults, though. We're great storytellers, and we listen to each other's stories, and we really want to learn from other people's experience if we can. Certainly that's a cheaper way to get the information than experiencing it personally.
True. And this is a great place to pause. And I wanted to remind the audience that we will be taking your questions in throughout. We also want to ask you some questions as well, just to kind of help tailor our conversation. So we actually have a really great question that we would like you all to answer. And the question is, what are one or two potential crises you feel that your organization isn't prepared for? And again, you can participate in this poll question by scanning the QR code. We'll get in your responses and we'll kind of help tailor our conversation based off some of your responses. And as we actually wait for you to kind of get your phones out, scan that QR code, I do want to ask you, Nellie, what's the one thing regarding planning for a potential crisis that organizations can do when they start to plan for potential crises that they could face?
I tend to urge people to put together a really diverse team and do this kind of audit. And as I note on this slide, it's this inability to anticipate. And so when you get a lot of diverse points of view together, it's amazing what you can do, and what sorts of vulnerabilities people will see that their different point of view will give them the insight that you need and the thoroughness that you need. So in this question that was just posed for you, I like to get people to consider really human caused crises. And my experience is that I want people to consider climate and weather and sort of based things, certainly, but I tend to find most organizations have done a reasonably good job of envisioning what would be the particular environmental concern in terms of weather or climate for wherever they happen to be located. So if their geographical area is more prone to earthquake or to flood or to ice storm or tornado, whatever, they tend to have looked at that. Now, not everyone's done a really good job of that, but I mean, they tend to have looked at that. And especially because they're more likely to have also faced such an event in the past. But when you get to the human-caused ones, I tend to think this is where you really need to think about it. You want to take a look at the extent of damage. You want to look at the effects when you think of a crisis and you want to begin prioritizing, getting started in this area. You want to see what this is going to mean internally for your employees, what it means for your organization and its survival, what it'll mean for the people you serve, whether they're customers, clients, stakeholders, however you envision them. But to really start to push the envelope here. And in today's program, I'm really going to push the envelope with you a lot. And it's not going to be necessarily that comfortable, but that's the whole point. If we really push ourselves to think about where vulnerabilities are, then down the road we can do much better planning, much better prevention, and of course we can head them off, and that's what we want to do. Head them off as early as we can.
And I want to thank everybody for participating in our Slido poll. We're starting to get some responses now, and I want to get your response to this, Nellie. So you were mentioning a little bit about human crises and environmental crises. Well, it seems like from our audience's responses, a big crisis that they feel that their organization isn't prepared for is one, cyber attacks and also industrial labor shortages. So what would be your response to, how some of our organizations can prepare for those two crises that are obviously very different? One being obviously cyber attacks, the other one being, an industry shortage of workers.
Yes. Well, I tend to think that with the issue of staffing, I think you really need to build your pipelines. You need to start looking at partnerships with educational institutions, and you need to get people who are good spokespersons for your particular kind of workplace or job, who'll go out and really talk to young people about what these jobs would be, and what you find exciting and rewarding about them, how they can be of value perhaps to the community or to the planet. You want people who are enthusiastic about this. Because the reality is that if you really want to hire people, you want them to think about your workplace as a career and not a job. You know, a job's a job, fine. It puts, you know, food on the table, gets a roof over your head. We recognize that. But you want to be able to build the kind of loyalty with an organization that means you want a career and a career path, and you want people to go out and sell your organization well. When it comes to cyber attacks, I would say I'm the best person to ask about that, but there is certainly expertise in this area. And one of the things I tend to also remind people about is that if you think you've done a really good job of preparation, then you want to hire someone or a group to be bad term for it, but assassin team. In other words, you want to have people test your protections, really look at whether they can hack into your system. I mean, that, you know, whatever it is, you want to test the works for that. And I've done that a little bit in workplaces where people want to go far enough that I create a scenario which gets around the things that they think they put in place, and we really try to simulate that and see what that's like. And you can do a lot with those kinds of drills, or to get your team to look at how they could defeat your system. And I always get a kick out of people telling me, you know, oh, we've got the best stuff in the world. And I always think back to schools, for example. I'll go to do some type of site visit or site investigation, and I'm in the building, and people said, how did you get in here? You didn't come in the front door through security. And I said, no, the back door at the kitchen, the loading dock was propped open. I saw cigarette butts there. People apparently this is what they're doing, is they're propping the door open so they can get out and get a smoke, whatever they're supposed to or not. And that's how I came in. And so this is why I think that you really need to probe your vulnerabilities really well. And sometimes you have to hire experts to do that for you. But that's really what you want, is you want to be able to get these alternative points of view, seeing where your weaknesses are. If we're getting some thoughts along this idea of some crises that you think you're not prepared to manage, I like to get people imagining that when a crisis hits, what is it about it that makes it what it is? When we say, yes, it's negatively going to affect you, you don't have the resources to cope. But when a crisis really starts, it tends to begin with insufficient information. Something's coming at you, whether it's bad publicity, you know, you've had a major equipment break, whatever. But the information surrounding that event and how it's unfolding is never ideal. And so we're forced to try to begin to respond when we don't have all the information we would like to have. And then as the crisis unfolds, the actual nature of it seems to escalate. We're caught up in it, we're trying to address it, and things keep hitting us from very different directions, and we're just caught up in that to the point where we really feel like we're in a trap, and we have a terrible loss of control, and we're struggling. And at the same time, we're being observed. You know, when a crisis hits, people are watching you. They may be stakeholders, clients, the public, people in your local environment, whatever it is, the particular crisis is. But you're going to be scrutinized. And certainly the media is going to be watching. If you're at all in any aspect of the public view, you're going to see intense scrutiny from outside. And that could involve, of course, regulatory agencies, people anxious to engage in legal action, and so on. But also within your organization, people are going to be watching to see how you handle this. Whether your organization is organized with a union or it's not, your employees are going to be observing how are we being handled? Are we being given good information? Are we being kept in the loop? You know, how can we help? Anything about that. People are watching. And to the point where organizations begin to feel like they're under siege. And as you can understand, if you've ever been through any kind of crisis, this is an extremely uncomfortable place to be. There's a lot of pressure, a lot of stress. And depending on the nature of the crises, you may be dealing with fatalities or illnesses or injuries, not just in your organization, but maybe in the locality or in the people you serve. There may be environmental damage, depending on the crisis, it could be very, very broad outfall. And this is really struggling here. It's very, very difficult to really address this. So when I say to people, you really want to think about the unthinkable, please keep in mind, it's never really a question of whether a crisis will hit. The reality is it's only a matter of time. Sometime things will happen. The question is, okay, what type of crisis are you going to be struggling with? How will it occur, unfold for you? But we cannot assume we are invulnerable. We really can't.
And I actually have a really great question that we just got in from EH. EH, I want to thank you so much for the question. So EH asks, Nellie, could you talk about how Southwest is handling their customer PR crisis in their technology crisis? And maybe even on a higher level, how should a major company like a Southwest handle a major PR crisis? And how can they plan for that ahead of time?
Well, I think the criticisms that I'm seeing leveled against them have been one where you're an organization that years ago was working extremely well, and what you did was to, so to speak, sit on your laurels. In other words, you praised yourself for your current success, but you didn't envision how change was really going to happen. And when you think about how any organization, as it expands, when you're dealing with sheer numbers, you have to develop more efficient ways of addressing those expanded numbers. Systems reach their limits. You do test runs, you do scenarios and simulations. What will this look like? Okay, so what will our future needs really be? And if it turns out that your system didn't grow, your software is antiquated, how did it become antiquated? How does anything become out of date? Because people assume whatever it is they have is going to be going on forever. Well, if that's true, we'd still have a lot of companies making buggy whips. Okay. When, we're not really using, horse or donkey drawn carts anymore. I mean, this is the reality. So nothing is going to stay stagnant. And as humans, again, one of our difficulties is dealing with change. We're creatures of habit, and we tend to get stuck in our ways, and it's uncomfortable to develop new habits or to push us in new directions because change is so uncomfortable. But we have to have a way to manage change. And I have colleagues who can help with managing change, but certainly we have to recognize that that's always going to be the case. So this is the reality. We want to be able to dig in and do a good job with our audit. And if you've begun your audit, of course, one of the things I like to say, if you're going to take this tool back to your organization, this is where, as we were saying just a moment ago, we want a team that's diverse. And I cannot overemphasize that. What people see as a crisis varies enormously with your point of view in the organization and often with your area specialization. And we have to be very careful that when we're looking at vulnerabilities, we really have done a good job here, and getting a diverse team thinking about vulnerability is really the easiest way to do it. Tap into the brains you have, because these diverse points of view are going to do a really good job for you. And I always think as an example of that, I was doing I was working with a colleague doing a public program on crisis management some years ago, and among the attendees were a couple of fairly high up individuals from a major national banking firm. And as we were going through envisioning different crises, we were sort of joking with them that being from a banking firm, probably their biggest worry would be robbery. And they said, no, robbery is not such a big thing for us. We have so many branches across the U.S. We have on average 3 robberies a day. So for us, robbery is not such a big deal. And so I said, but if you're working in one of those branches and someone comes up to your window and gives you, a note and points a gun at you, do you think that first line worker's point of view is going to be, robbery's not such a big deal?
Exactly,
Okay.
yeah.
So I think it's so important that we really do have a diverse group of points of view going on here. So I like to say, the view of upper management, the view of first line employees is going to be remarkably different. If you have a labor union, their views are going to be different. HR and employee assistance can show you lots of interesting vulnerabilities here: security, health and safety, environmental people, their notions of things. And then when you look at things like your financial people, your legal advisors, and as I say, in so many workplaces, the viewpoint of crisis from the standpoint of operations and that of maintenance are often very, very different. Their risks at their jobs are very different. So what they see as potential problems. And then, public relations, the whole issue of communication, both inside and outside, is very important. Because even if you do a very, very good job of managing the crisis itself, you can do the communication so badly that the public's perception of how you handled the crisis was that you don't know what you're doing, when in reality you did a very good job, but you weren't conveying that. And that sort of takes me back to the issue so many years ago of Intel having a computer chip that had an error in it, and the calculation error, if I remember correctly, was way out in so many decimal places out that most people probably would never have had an issue with it. But there were people doing apparently some intricate calculations where they needed that level of accuracy, and they complained that Intel had sold them a defective chip, and that got out in the media. And Intel, basically gave as reasoning what I just kind of said, which was most people probably won't have that as a concern. And of course, the public that had bought, equipment, computers, and so forth with these chips in there, said, well, Intel, you sold me a defective chip. Okay, and they screamed about it. So then Intel came back with better communication and said, well, we recognize that this error is probably not going to affect that many people, but we recognize the chip is defective, and if anybody wants a replacement chip, we will provide it free of charge. Okay, well, almost no one asked for one. You treat people with respect, this is what you get, and as a result. And so good communication. I just can't overemphasize. I hope I got that story reasonably accurately. But that's kind of the gist of what I recall as being the perception of that. But that's the reality. So there's nothing like having diverse points of view to show you this. And of course, the then advantage of that is that when you go to do preparation for planning and for recovery, you have expertise in these areas that can say, well, here's what we're going to need. And then they can talk to your, PR and communications people and say, these are the sort of messages we're going to want to be able to convey. Can you prepare some of those? And then if this ever happens, this stuff is already there in place. It doesn't need much tweaking, and you're ready to go. And you head off things quickly. And tremendous advantage of having a diverse team, just tremendous advantage.
And you touched on this a little bit earlier on in the conversation, but I did want to get our audience's response to one other question that's also part of your slide deck here. And the question that I want to ask our audience, just by scanning that QR code again, is how would your organization manage if more than one crisis happened at the same time? So Nellie, you had mentioned, for example, if there was a technical glitch or something, it turns into a PR nightmare. So I'd love to get some of the audience's responses on that question. And again, you can do that by scanning our QR code. And while we're kind of waiting for those responses, I wanted to check, Nellie, and see, is there an ideal crisis team? So should it involve one person from each unit of the organization, or should it involve a mixture of, middle management, upper management, entry level? Is there kind of an ideal team that you think would be perfect for handling a potential crisis?
No, I just think, looking at your organization, see how many different points of view you can really pull together, and the value of getting them around the table at the same time. Because the nice thing about that is they spark each other. And they start creating good stories, or, you find stories coming from people's experience, which is ideal. This is one of the things that I think is so powerful when you look at a workforce that is an aging workforce, is they bring so many years of experience. And you want to capture that. This is a great way to capture that before people retire, for example, is to capture what they know, and sometimes don't even realize that they know. I was in an organization last year where that happened. I was taking them through some various crisis failure types of scenarios, and one of them was a few equipment breakdowns and failures that I was taking them through, and I said, well, if this broke down in particular, do you have any backup, any fallback position, or whatever? And there was a much older employee there, well into his 60s, still working, who said that, well, we had a backup system like that in this other building, and it's been, not been used for decades, but it's there. We could start that back up and use it. And everybody around, who was so much younger, had no idea that equipment was even there.
Oh, wow.
So this is the value of doing this. You really can capture a lot of things. And I make a good argument that crisis management is one of those tools that you can use for organizational memory, to capture this knowledge that people have, and particularly to capture it before people retire. Because, as I said, sometimes they don't even realize what they know. And you get a diverse group together, and the conversations start, the ideas come out, people, spark each other. It's amazing, the creativity that comes to bear. So you don't want to lose all that brain power. You've been paying for it. So why aren't you using it?
Yeah, and I want to just quickly turn over to some of the audience responses. So we are starting to get some responses from the QR code that we sent out, and I want to kind of get your thoughts on this, Nellie. So the two biggest things that we saw come in for how organizations would deal with multiple crises at the same time were hire a crisis team and divide and conquer. Is this typically what you see whenever you go into some of these organizations when they are planning or kind of dealing with a crisis?
Well, the real issue here, I think, is that when you've done some good planning, and particularly done some envisioning of scenarios and looking at what recovery would take, you can build in that capacity. And it's true, that capacity may not necessarily always be within your organization. It may be resources that you access when you need them, but you need to explore their existence, make arrangements with them, know that they're going to be able to respond when you need them. So yes, not every specialization necessarily is something that's going to be internal. Some of your expertise may indeed be external. You call on it when you need it. But you need to be able to envision that need and have those resources, planned out ahead of time. So, were there any other things that came in from the audience? Otherwise, I'll make a few other points here.
So we had divide and conquer was a big one, and then we also had hire a crisis team. So those were kind of the two big responses that we got from people when we asked them, how would your organization deal with multiple crises at the same time? But you also were talking a little bit about, developing your crisis team and who you should pick and everything like that. And I actually just got a great question in from Christine, and she actually asks, it seems common that there are individuals who are sounding warnings but get ignored or silenced and criticized for being, quote, negative. She brought up the example of Southwest as an example. And she wants to know what can be done about this. Maybe someone at an entry level position sounding off about maybe a potential crisis to upper management. How should we handle these types of scenarios?
Well, I think that what you need to do in organization is foster the kind of culture in which that information moves upwards. You're paying people's time. You've got, their brain power engaged in this job. If they see things, you want that information to be conveyed upwards. That is really such an important key. And my view is you cannot have an organization really, to me, functioning extremely well if all you hear from are the positive voices. The negative voices are seeing things that others are not seeing. And there are occasions where you think to yourself, but I don't want to hear the negativity. But that's a strength, and you want to nurture that. I always think back to an incident that happened with the space shuttle that was like that, where you had people who were basically saying, there's a problem here, you shouldn't launch, we've got to go fix this. But gradually, those people were sidelined away from the team because the team got tired of hearing from the naysayers. And what do we end up with? A disaster. So I think that you want those other points of view, and it doesn't matter they're negative. Someone's seeing something that others have not seen. Their observations are valuable, so you pass them upwards and you explore them. They may be real, they may not be real. Doesn't matter. But imagine if they were real, what you could do with that. And going back and saying, oh yeah, someone warned us about that, but we just weren't paying any attention. It's too late later, if what you've got is fatalities, you've got disaster, and you could have done something and you didn't. And that has been seen with, some of the incidents that we've seen in workplaces with violence, where people knew that a particular individual was, not himself or herself, or there was a problem, or the person perceived unfairness and complained about it a lot, and nothing was done and then it festered. So you want to really have a culture in which those kinds of things are reported and they're followed up on and investigated. They may or may not go anywhere. Fine. But the fact that information is not lost, it's captured.
And do you find that happens a lot or a little or moderately in some of the organizations that you've worked with in the past, that if someone, brings up a worst case scenario, maybe they're silenced or not, taken as seriously as they should?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, again, it's kind of our human nature. I think we want to shut down the naysayers. We're enthusiastic. We want to get moving ahead. We don't want to hear these negative voices that we feel are holding us back or whatever. But to me, those points of view are precious. They are information that you're paying for. And why are you not learning from that? We can't all see everything. That's why the diversity of points of view is so valuable. We kick ourselves later when we find we've ignored something that was important and we could have done something about it.
And
what should we do?
Sure.
Yeah, too late now.
True. And we've talked about kind of crisis or crises on, a large scale, but I'd be interested to know what are some of the different crises types. I know you have about 11 different types.
Yes, in fact, I'll take a look actually at that slide right now, and it should be in also people's handouts as a list after the audit. And I like people to really push the envelope on vulnerability. So if you think about the items you've already come up with as areas of vulnerability, see if you've got any things on this list which are not on your list. Maybe they're not there because you've already done good work on them, but maybe there are areas you hadn't thought about. So I think, of the issue of criminal attacks, it can be terrorism, crimes of any sort happen in your workplace. It could be violence, it could be embezzlement, falsification of reports and documents and things that get you into serious trouble. And these are deliberate things, and they could be done internally in your workforce. They could be coming from outside. Economic attacks, these could be, attempts to privatize your organization. They may be threats of mergers. Again, they may be financial malfeasance. They could be competition. They could be, people stealing information that's critical for your marketplace. Think very, very broadly here, and also think that economic attacks can be very, very expensive legal actions, and so forth. Loss of proprietary information is one that I sometimes have people struggling a bit with in their workplace, because they like to say to me, well, it's not like we have patents on anything. And I said, yeah, but proprietary information could be information about your workforce. It could be private data on people, everything from their social security numbers to their health information to credit card information, things like that. It could be things that are unique to your process that you not necessarily have patented, but you've learned, explored, developed, improved, and they are critical for your organization's success. Industrial disasters, I typically think of as things happening to your supply chain, maybe disasters that happened in your environment and you were affected by that. They could be environmental releases in your neighborhood from a neighboring industry that pollutes your air, your soil, things like that. But in other words, major issues that could involve, train wrecks. They could be vehicle problems. It's a tank truck with gasoline. Wrecks, and it's in the sewer and setting, all of the sewers in your facility on fire. I mean, there are all kinds of things that can go wrong here. As I said earlier, natural disasters, I tend to find people done a little bit better job of those, or at least considered them. So I tend to feel that that's more a case of what if this happens at the same time as something else. Breaks in equipment, what's critical for you? Are there ways you can build in redundancy? Are there groups of similar industries in your area where you can be willing to share things in a disaster? And you really need to look at, how critical are some of these components. And remember, some of them are not always available locally. There may be supply chain concerns. We've had a lot of experience the last couple of years with what that issue of supply chain really means. Legal concerns, we're subject to all kinds of regulations. What is your organization facing when it comes to anything that in terms of standards it needs to meet, lawsuits that people want to just waste your time with or tie you up with? And keep in mind, even if something never gets beyond the discovery stage, you can still spend a lot of money in the discovery stage. Now, as I was remarking earlier, this issue of reputation perception is is one that, once lost is really hard to regain. Regaining people's trust. You think back to, the Tylenol tampering situation. Any kind of product where people can give it a bad reputation. That's really going to be a tough one sometimes to regain people's trust. And oftentimes this is how the perception is in the media. It may be, just bad rumors put out by the competition, but if it damages, your reputation, you have to really address it. Now, the issue of human resources occupational, it can be false credentialing. I think we've had issues in the media that right now that are showing what false credentialing is all about. But people claiming to have, licenses, certifications they don't have, backgrounds that they don't have. But they could be issues internally that involve discrimination of various kinds, harassment, bullying, and so forth, kinds of issues. Health issues, well, I don't think I need to berate the issue of disease, but those could be internal. They may be occupational exposures to various hazards. They may be things that are that we're facing as a community or as a species, which affect us as the pandemic has been. They could be things that may affect your stakeholders as well, such as if you're a food processor and so forth. And of course, regulatory, depending on which organization it is, there's bound to be regulations you have to meet. So what might be problems failing to meet those? So if any of these struck you as, well, that probably is not likely to happen here, I would get my diverse team together and still throw it at them, because you may very well not realize that you have that vulnerability. It's just not something you've thought about before. So that's kind of the way I like to sort of push this, because once you start thinking about these different categories, many crises, will have more than one category hit, because they're aspects. Maybe it may hit so many different types of outfalls possible. I mean, failure to meet a regulation may cost you money. It may be a legal issue. It may result in a disaster or a health problem, and so on. So I think it's really very, very important that you really don't think that some of these can't happen here. Now, of course, over time, as you begin to do some planning, you'll start thinking about how you want to prioritize these. And maybe you want to go after the most damaging one first, or maybe you want to go after the one that's most likely first. But you want to gradually, push the envelope and think about all of these.
And I just want to remind the audience, again, we're sharing some resources that are very, very helpful to you. Obviously, that crisis management exercise, we can put that right in the chat there. And then a link to Buffalo Collabs, as well as Nellie's email address, can be found in our audience chat, as well as if you're watching the recording, it can be found right there at the bottom of the registration page. So we've been kind of talking all day about crises, Nellie, and I'd be interested to know, are there some early signs maybe that an organization should look for when they're thinking about, hey, we might be facing a potential crisis coming up?
Yes, I tend to think of crises as unfolding in various phases, and that when you want to do your crisis management, you want to try to take a look at these various areas. And one of them is signal detection. Is there anything out that would give you a warning that a particular crisis is starting to unfold? Because then you can begin to call your plan into action and start heading it off and turning it into a non-event. So in future modules, perhaps we will look at some of these other aspects, but I particularly would like you to think about some of these questions we've already raised for you, is signal detection. how to scan the environment for some early warning signs of potential crisis. So when you think about different crises, I had put this into your handout as well, of just getting you to envision crises of various kinds and thinking about what might be the earliest indication that something like this is unfolding. And it's why we were saying earlier that if you have a culture that's very good at passing bad news upwards, you may find it extremely helpful to encourage that kind of culture when it comes to some of these different crisis families, because coming up with what might be early detection, that is gold, when you can do that. So you might think about that. If your organization is prone to, say, a financial crisis, what might be the earliest indications that a financial issue is likely to begin? We like to think that, well, we'll do audits, we'll catch stuff then, but are there people willing to be whistleblowers who are not afraid to say that, something internally is not looking right to me? You want that, okay? Earlier, people were mentioning, the issue of cyber attacks. What are indications that your computer system is compromised? Do you have computers that you have good firewalls for? Do you limit where certain computers can go into the outside world, as opposed to those that handle only things internally in your organization and have no outside contact at all? When you need to cross over from what's internal to what would be external, do you have only a specific person or place where that happens, specific ways that you do that? Chemical spills, what kind of monitoring do you do? What kinds of precautions? Do you have, spill control plans? Do you have ways to capture stuff? Again, you don't want to wait for someone to say to you, hey, I spotted a bunch of dead fish in the river, oh boy, because that, is going to be on the media. Sexual harassment, any types of internal discrimination. Are people facing issues where they are being made uncomfortable? They feel pressured. They're being treated with less than appropriate respect. And of course, with workplace violence, a lot of times these issues arise out of people feeling they've been treated unfairly. How do you address that? When someone needs to be severed from an organization, how do you make sure that they can't get back in, either personally, electronically, whatever? Do you help them without placement? Do you help them to find their next job, so they're not left so bereft that they are a danger, or are simply a health risk for themselves and their families? Because let's face it, losing a job is devastating.
And we did get
loss of key employees. I always remind people we're an aging workforce, so don't forget about capturing information but in any event, signal detection. Look at your vulnerabilities, see those crisis families, and explore with your team what might be some early indicators.
And we actually have gotten a couple responses from people when we ask them, what are some signals that alert them to, that they're facing a potential crisis. And some of those responses were, like you touched on, behavioral changes, rats fleeing, sinking ship, angry emails, things like that. But I just got a great audience question, and I wanted to make sure I got this one in before we wrapped up the session today. So Anon asked, during the process of identifying risks and mitigating those risks that can lead to crisis, what role does the executive sponsor have in communicating back to the team? So what level does the highest person up in the organization have to responding?
Well, certainly, you're going to be obviously the highest level for the managing of the crisis. It's always going to be, the buck stops here. But I also think you have a very important role in communication. When you have to communicate, often, especially bad news, the higher up that the person can express their sympathy, their willingness to do what's necessary to help the organization recover, their concern for their workforce, their concern for their stakeholders and people affected. The higher up the person is to do this, the better that and stronger, more powerful that communication is. So yes, you want it to come from the very top if you possibly can.
And audience, I want to thank you so much for joining me today and participating in our poll and everything like that. So one last question for you, Nellie. If you could kind of reach out to our audience and kind of give them, one piece of advice or one thing to kind of think about as they, kind of go out there and think about crisis planning, what's that one thing that you would want our audience to know?
Well, I would say to never rule out an area of vulnerability and say it can never happen here. I think we need to be very careful about never say never, because that is, if you really think that's never going to happen here, that's the one you probably are not prepared for. That's the one that's going to bite.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nellie. And that gives us all one thing to think about. Never say never. Perfect. Audience, I want to thank you again so much for joining me today. Nellie, thank you so much for doing this with us. Again, like I mentioned before, some of these additional resources can be found right there at the bottom of the registration page for all those who are watching the recording. You can also find a link to the crisis management exercise as well on there, a downloadable document. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good rest of your day and have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.